My name is Catherine Clark. I'm the mother of Carl Alford, and he is my little sepsis survivor. Carl, before sepsis, was the busiest, most rambunctious, and friendliest little critter I've ever met in my entire life. The few days leading up to Carl's illness were a pretty standard issue. He's always been a croupy kid, and every time he's got a cough, he always sounded pretty barky. And his cough had started on a Thursday, and we just did as we normally did. He didn't have a fever, so we just continued per usual. That Friday we had gone to the homecoming parade, and that Saturday his dad had taken him to his very first football game. And again, everything continued as his normal viral course for upper respiratory infections. It changed Monday night when he developed a stridor sounding cough. So we took him to the pediatric office. His lungs were clear, he was at 100%, and they diagnosed him with stridor, which is not unusual for children, and sent us home on oral prednisone. Wednesday morning rolled around, and normally he would wake me up around 6:30, and I jumped out of bed. It was 8 o'clock, and he still hadn't woken up yet. So I had run into his room, and he was laying in his bed, working very hard to breathe and very lethargic. I took his temperature, and he was 102.7, and that was the highest his temperature had ever been in his life. So I took a breath and tried to calm down and run through the steps. Is this something that can be resolved with some Tylenol? You know, is this just how his body reacts when he has a fever like that? So I got some Tylenol down the hatch and reached out to his pediatrician. I've been a nurse for 15 years. I have a stethoscope. So I listened to his lungs. They sounded clear, but when I checked his oxygen saturations, they were about 93%, which was really alarming. So, you know, we could tell something was going wrong, but the challenging part with Carl was his lungs sounded clear, and we had this child who was obviously struggling to breathe, but didn't sound like he should struggle breathing. We brought him in and we gave him a couple breathing treatments to see if that kind of turned things around. And what had happened after his breathing treatments was it opened his airway enough that we could actually hear the nightmare that he had been hiding from us. What she had said was his airway was so constricted, there wasn't enough air moving through to hear the rattles and the wheezing and the crackles from the pneumonia and the struggle that he was having. So she sent us to the ER. The first time I realized it was critical, was after we'd already been in the ER for a few hours. They had initially diagnosed him with a right lower lobe pneumonia that they didn't sound too alarmed about, and had decided that he had asthma on top of pneumonia. So they were treating him with continuous albuterol, and they were going to send us to a regular medical floor. The moment I realized that things were going differently was when his oxygen saturations had started to trend down again, and I called for them to send the respiratory therapist, and she gave him a once-over, put him on high flow. That bought him a ticket up. And really when we got there was when I realized that things were a lot more critical than RSV and asthma and pneumonia. They initially tried to do something called a BiPAP, and they put a mask on them to try to inflate the lungs and to better oxygenate. They were never able to get his saturations to respond. So I, again, having been a nurse, I anticipated that they were going to intubate him, and they did. And I had a moment of feeling like we were safe. He had an airway. We're gonna get through this. And the hardest moment was when they brought me back in after they told me he was stable. And I saw his saturations were worse than when I left. And Carl, being a redheaded ginger baby who was sedated but fighting the sedation, looked me in the eyes and was screaming "Mommy" at me over the tube when they had to send me back out, because he in fact was nowhere near stable. and he was just starting his very, very difficult transition to near death. Carl was put on ECMO initially to treat his respiratory failure and his lungs' inability to breathe. And ECMO is this incredible device that can function as heart or lungs or both. One of the things that they do prior to starting ECMO is evaluate your heart function. And at the time, Carl's heart function was normal. So they decided to do what's called VV ECMO. And they put very large tubes in your vein in your neck. Frequently with lung failure, you see some amounts of heart failure. And with Carl, his heart rapidly failed. And within a few hours of being told everything was stable, he became, the term that they use is mottled, so he was very gray, very blue. They were having numbers they didn't like again. And they brought cardiology in, and they decided to go ahead and start VA. And while they were starting the VA in the cath lab was when his ejection fraction went to 0. So thankfully, everything happened in time, and they were able to hook Carl up to the cardiac version of ECMO that was allowing blood to be pumped to the rest of his body. And from that point forward, the idea of coming home without Carl was very real. And the moment it peaked was when we just had so many moments of we have Carl stable. You can come in the room now, and we go in the room and he's not stable. And after doing the lung ECMO, after doing the heart ECMO, after putting a hole through the atrium in his heart to offload the pressure on his heart, all of the extra tubes and cannulas and everything, they told us that he was stable. And I walk into the room and the ECMO machines are still alarming. His heart, the vital sign monitor is still alarming. There's still a team of people in the room working on him, and he is not stable. And the moment I thought it was over was when they were trying to figure out why his ECMO wasn't working. But as I was watching them do this, they didn't have me leave the room, which is an indicator there might not have been Carl when I would come back. And the last thing standing in between Carl and death was opening his chest to do direct ECMO. So in those moments, I knew we were as close as we could get without him actually dying. There were many encounters with our hospital team that provided hope. I appreciated the clarity and how concise it was when his team talked to us about how Carl was doing, where he stood, and what it was going to look, what recovery was going to look like. And it made decision-making a lot easier. And then when Carl miraculously had cardiac return, there was very minimal hope that we were going to leave the hospital with Carl's native heart. As bad as his heart had failed, no one had ever seen any recovery. So we thought if we brought Carl home, we were bringing Carl and a transplanted heart home. But he did us a solid and did what he wanted to do. And we were able to discontinue the cardiac ECMO. And at that point, we got to meet one of our bright, shining stars, which was his physical therapist. She is remarkable and essentially nearly one of a kind in the entire United States, and she is incredibly brave and gets children up and out of bed while they're on ECMO and starts aggressive physical therapy. And she gave us hope that not only Carl was going to recover, but we were going to recover to a nearly able body. And her demeanor with children and the way she was able to motivate Carl to work and work through his spicy little attitude was incredible. Every time she came to see us, it brought hope and sunshine.
All the way. Push it down.
Whee! And his orthopedic surgeon is incredibly optimistic, and she said we're going to give it, I think it was like another month, to see how his body could heal on its own before she took him to the OR. His 3 toe tips on his right foot, and we ended up with what started as a midfoot amputation across the long bones, but since we've been discharged, it's become more of a hind foot amputation. So he basically has like his heel and his ankle. We were in the hospital for a total of 106 days. So a little over 3.5 months. Carl, where do you want to go? And then it's really completely and totally altered our entire lives. And part of me feels like we're getting back to it, but I don't think that that properly describes the newness and complete difference in life post-sepsis. But it feels like we're getting back to something that feels like life and something that has fun and adventure back into the game where we had lost adventure for nearly 2 years. I think people need to give children more credit for their incredible will to live and their incredible will to play. And I look at my son, who every part of him was broken, and he was so deeply motivated to get up, to get back to his friends. He wanted to go play on the playground, and on days he didn't want to do PT, his PT would ask, "Don't you want to go wave at babies?" And it got him every single time. Nothing has touched his deep will for life, for anything. He is a very, very willful child. Carl's character and spirit is unmovable. He is the river that carved the Grand Canyon.